was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. Nestled between rolling hills and maple-lined streets, its charm was in its predictability. Kids played in yards while neighbors waved from porches, and the most exciting event was usually the annual fall fair. That morning, a golden sun slipped between clouds, casting long shadows over streets littered with crisp autumn leaves. It seemed like a morning any resident would remember fondly, until the courthouse doors opened and everything changed. Inside the county courthouse, tension was electric. Reporters whispered across the polished floors, cameras clicking softly, microphones swaying as sound engineers checked levels. Onlookers filled the benches, clutching bags, folders, and notebooks, all sharing the same nervous energy. The town had been captivated for weeks by the case at hand, a high-profile trial that had become impossible to ignore. A man, local but not beloved, was accused of a crime that had shaken the community to its core. Some feared for justice, others feared that it wouldn't come at all. Detectives stood near the back, a figure of quiet authority. The trial had dragged on for days, with witness testimony that twisted into conflicting accounts and evidence that seemed damning one moment and fragile the next. He ran a hand over his worn leather notebook, the one he carried since joining the force years ago, and sighed. No matter how much experience he had, this case was different. The air inside the courtroom was thick, suffocating almost, and even the walls seemed to lean in, listening. At the front, a police dog sat alert, coiled energy radiating from his taut muscles. Max, a German shepherd with amber eyes that could pierce through shadows, was no ordinary K9. Trained to detect threats, narcotics, explosives, and even certain human scents, Max had been part of the department for 4 years. Today, he was more than a tool of law enforcement. He was part of the trial. The prosecution intended to use him to validate critical evidence. It was a demonstration meant to remove doubt from every juror's mind. Yet even as Max's tail twitched with anticipation, none of the adults noticed the most unlikely witness in the room. A tiny, 3-year-old child with curly hair and an unassuming stare, sitting in her mother's lap, was clutching her stuffed rabbit with one hand while the other fiddled with the hem of her mother's sweater. She had come simply because her mother had no one else to leave her with, but something about the courtroom had caught her attention. The polished wood, the formal faces, the weight of the proceedings, it was overwhelming yet fascinating. Her small fingers gripped her rabbit as her gaze wandered over the rows of people, lingering finally on Max. The dog looked so serious, so formidable. But too, he was curious, almost like another child in the room. Her mother whispered softly, trying to keep her calm, but focus was unwavering. The judge entered, his robe swaying, and a hush fell over the room. The gavel hit the bench, commanding attention. Cameras zoomed in as he reminded the courtroom of its duty: impartiality, focus, and respect for the law. The defendant, sitting at the front, seemed smaller under the weight of public scrutiny, eyes darting nervously between the judge, the jury, and the gallery. The prosecution had laid out the morning's agenda: evidence presentation, followed by Max's demonstration. Every adult knew the drill, every protocol was rehearsed, but no one had anticipated the variable that sat quietly on the edge of a bench, twisting her rabbit in her small hands. As the first piece of evidence was brought forward, photographs and objects that the prosecution claimed were linked to the crime, his eyes never left Max. The dog sniffed and circled, every step precise and practiced, yet soft voice escaped before anyone noticed. "Hello, Max." It was almost swallowed by the hum of murmurs, but something subtle flickered in Max's amber gaze. His ears twitched, head tilting slightly as if recognizing her presence. Detective noticed the small movement and frowned. Dogs didn't just respond to whispers in courtrooms. Something was about to break the meticulous order everyone had spent months preparing for. The tension in the room coiled as lawyers prepared for their next moves. The prosecution's lead attorney, a tall man with a sharp jaw and a sharper tone, called Max forward. Cameras captured the motion, jurors leaned in, and the defendant swallowed nervously. The dog approached the evidence with all the precision of a seasoned professional, sniffing, analyzing, alert. His little voice, innocent and unassuming, floated across the space. "He's my friend." The courtroom froze. Papers rustled, a pencil dropped somewhere in the gallery, and even the judge paused mid-sentence. Detective felt a jolt, a shiver running down his spine. Max stiffened. Something in that simple, 3-year-old declaration had interrupted the dog's instincts, causing a hesitation no one could have anticipated. The smallest voice in the room had pierced through layers of procedure, training, and expectation. His mother instinctively leaned closer, whispering, "Sweetie, it's okay, stay quiet." But his gaze never wavered from Max. The dog, trained to react to certain cues, now seemed uncertain. His posture shifted slightly, his growl subdued, his focus torn. A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. Prosecutors exchanged tight-lipped glances, defense attorneys leaned forward with sudden curiosity, and the jurors whispered among themselves, eyes flicking between the child and the dog. No one could have predicted it. The meticulously rehearsed trial, designed to leave no room for doubt, now had an unpredictable factor: a 3-year-old's pure instinctive connection with a police dog. And as the first hour of the trial drew on, everyone in that courtroom understood one unshakable truth. This child, entirely unaware of the gravity of her surroundings, had already begun to change the course of events. The air seemed to thrum with anticipation, the calm before the storm. Something remarkable, and possibly unprecedented, was about to unfold. Outside, the quiet streets were still, unaware that inside the courthouse, a tiny voice and a faithful dog had set in motion a chain of events that could upend the entire trial. And as whispered again, her words almost too soft to hear, the dog's amber eyes met hers, and for the first time in the day, even the adults held their breath. The courtroom was buzzing, though no one wanted to admit it. Behind the polished wooden benches, reporters shifted in their seats, cameras trained, ready to catch any flicker of drama. Every click of a camera shutter seemed louder than usual. The townspeople, many of them friends and neighbors of both the defendant and the alleged victims, sat frozen in a mixture of fascination and fear. Conversation stopped mid-word as the judge's gavel tapped again, restoring a fragile sense of order. Yet beneath the formalities, tension simmered, thick enough to choke on. Detective remained near the back, leaning against the cool wall of the courtroom. He rubbed his hands together, eyes flicking constantly between the evidence table, the jury, and Max, the police dog. He had seen thousands of cases, countless witnesses, and innumerable exhibits, yet something about this day felt different, ominous, unpredictable. Max was a seasoned K9, trained to remain focused regardless of distractions. But today, a tiny figure in the gallery, a curly-haired girl with a stuffed rabbit, seemed to exert a subtle influence that no one could explain. His mother tried to keep her daughter calm, whispering softly in her ear, but his curiosity was insatiable. She tilted her head toward the dog, eyes wide, absorbing every detail: the black sheen of his coat, the way his ears twitched at the slightest sound, the disciplined intensity of his gaze. Unlike the adults, she was not intimidated by the courtroom or the legal proceedings. To her, the courtroom was just another place full of new people, new rules, and most importantly, a new friend. The defendant shifted in his seat, hands clenched, face pale. He had watched as the prosecution presented evidence in a methodical, almost mechanical manner. Fingerprints, photographs, and witness statements, all designed to build an airtight case. But even he noticed Max's unusual behavior. The dog, trained to react decisively to certain scents, hesitated, glanced briefly toward, and then adjusted his stance. The defense attorney, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, noticed the same thing and raised a subtle eyebrow. Something unprecedented was unfolding before them. The prosecutor, tall and imposing, called Max forward, his voice firm. "We will now demonstrate the K9's ability to identify the suspects sent from the evidence." Max moved with practiced precision, paws clicking against the courtroom floor. The jury leaned forward, notebooks poised, expecting the flawless performance they had been promised. But Max slowed as he approached the evidence. His body tensed, ears flicking toward the small figure in the gallery. For a fraction of a second, he froze completely. unaware of the legal and procedural significance of what was happening, whispered softly, almost to herself, "It's okay, Max. He's my friend." The words were barely audible to the adults, yet Max reacted instantly. His head tilted, eyes locking on, and he stepped back slightly. The room collectively inhaled, though no one admitted to it. The defense attorney's hand twitched, her mind racing. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. He had never seen a K-9 falter like this. Detective felt a chill run down his spine. Trained instincts rarely faltered, and yet here, in the quiet power of a child's voice, something had shifted the balance entirely. Jurors exchanged glances. Some whispered, incredulous. Others sat rigid, unsure of what they had just seen. Max's hesitation was more than a small delay. It was a crack in the foundation of the prosecution's case. If the dog's identification was questionable, then a key piece of the evidence might be compromised. The weight of possibility pressed on the room like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. Outside the courtroom, the town had begun to stir. News crews caught wind of the unusual proceedings, snippets of whispers spreading through social media. 3-year-old interacts with police dog in court. And K-9 hesitation causes shock in trial. Within minutes, the story had gone viral, drawing attention from not only local but national audiences. Usually a sleepy town had become the epicenter of an unfolding legal mystery. His mother gripped her daughter tightly, unsure whether to intervene or let her curiosity continue. Leaned forward, her small fingers clutching the rabbit, whispering again, "It's okay, Max, don't be scared." The dog's posture softened. His body remained alert, but the tension in his muscles eased. Even the most seasoned handlers recognized the significance. A mere toddler had calmed a highly trained K-9 in a situation designed to provoke certainty. The judge, sensing the courtroom was on edge, called for a brief recess. Papers rustled, chairs scraped against the polished floor, and murmurs spread like wildfire. Detectives and lawyers huddled, analyzing what had just occurred. The prosecution argued in hushed tones about protocol and whether the demonstration could continue. The defense exchanged quiet smiles. The moment had already planted seeds of doubt in the minds of jurors. Oblivious to the tension, simply hugged her rabbit and smiled at Max, who now sat calmly beside the evidence table. For Detective, the implications were staggering. A child's innocence had created a variable that no one could control. He scribbled notes in his worn notebook, documenting behavior, timing, and reactions. This was not a typical courtroom observation. It was an event that could influence the outcome of the trial itself. Every instinct told him that what had done and the dog had responded to would be remembered long after the trial concluded. As the recess ended and the courtroom slowly settled, his quiet presence continued to cast a shadow over the proceedings. Max remained calm but watchful, eyes occasionally flicking toward the small girl. The adults in the room, trained to anticipate every possibility, now found themselves confronted with the unpredictable power of innocence. The tension was palpable, as if the entire courtroom collectively understood that the next moments could irrevocably alter the course of the trial. And as the judge called the court back into session, everyone, jurors, attorneys, detectives, and even the defendant, held their breath. His presence had changed everything. What had started as a routine trial in a quiet town had become something extraordinary, a collision of innocence and trained instinct, hinting that the smallest voice in the room might wield the most unexpected power. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Max, the police dog, approached the evidence table. Every footstep he took against the polished wood seemed in the still air. The prosecution's lead attorney, a man whose reputation for precision was matched only by his stubbornness, nodded to the handler. "Max, do your job," he commanded, his voice crisp, professional, almost mechanical. But for the first time in the K-9's 4 years of service, there was hesitation. Max paused, nose twitching. His trained instincts told him to identify the scent, to react without question. But something stopped him, a subtle pull he could not ignore. His amber eyes flicked toward the gallery, toward the small, curly-haired figure leaning forward in her mother's lap. Fingers gripped her stuffed rabbit as she whispered softly, "It's okay, Max. He's my friend." The words were barely audible, but they resonated in the dog's mind in a way no command, no treat, no prior training ever had. He took a tentative step back, lowering his head slightly. The courtroom collectively inhaled. A pencil dropped somewhere near the press table. Someone gasped quietly. The defendant shifted nervously, sensing the shift in atmosphere. This was not part of the plan. The prosecution's assistant whispered urgently to the lead attorney, who shot a sharp glance at Max and the handler. "He's faltering," one whispered. "Do we continue?" The lead attorney's jaw tightened, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. "We can't show weakness in front of the jury," he muttered under his breath, eyes locked on the dog, yet there was nothing he could do. Max, trained to obey commands without hesitation, was now influenced by a 3-year-old's pure, instinctive presence. The jury, a mix of townspeople, leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide. Murmurs spread quietly among them, almost imperceptible, yet loaded with curiosity and doubt. Witnesses exchanged confused glances. Even the judge, maintaining his professional composure, furrowed his brow. He had seen courtroom interruptions before, arguments, outbursts, even procedural errors, but nothing like this. The focus of a child, innocent yet unyielding, had disrupted the expected order of events in a way no adult could have predicted. His mother instinctively leaned closer, whispering, "Sweetie, it's okay. Just stay still." But his attention never wavered. She gazed at Max with an intensity far beyond her years, as if she could communicate directly with him through sight and voice alone. Max, responding in ways that conventional K-9 training, backed slightly away from the evidence. His posture softened, muscles relaxing, yet his alertness never faltered entirely. He remained aware, watchful, but the rigid certainty expected by the prosecution had dissolved. The defense attorney, sharp-eyed and quick to sense opportunity, took a subtle step forward. She whispered to her client, barely audible, "Do you see what I see?" The defendant, tense and pale, nodded slightly, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in weeks. The defense knew the trial had hinged on Max's demonstration. Without the dog's decisive identification, the prosecution's case weakened. The room held its collective breath, aware that the tide might be shifting. Outside, in the hallways and parking lot, reporters murmured frantically into phones and cameras, capturing snippets of the unfolding drama. Social media accounts began to ping incessantly. 3-year-old calms police dog in court. K-9 hesitation throws trial into chaos. Child stops evidence from being used. A town that had rarely made headlines was now the focus of national curiosity. Everyone wanted to know, how could a child's innocence wield such influence over a trained professional dog, and by extension, the outcome of a trial? Inside the courtroom, tension coiled. The prosecutor tried to regain control. "Max, continue," he ordered firmly, a subtle edge of frustration creeping into his voice. The handler clicked his tongue and nudged the dog gently, attempting to redirect him. Max, but not as expected. He approached the evidence again, but his movements were cautious, tentative. Each sniff, each step seemed measured, as if he were considering more than scent alone. Small voice floated again, soft and clear. "It's okay, he won't hurt anyone." The words, simple yet pure, seemed to anchor Max's hesitation. He did not react aggressively. He did not bark or growl. He simply observed, shifting his weight but remaining calm. The courtroom felt frozen in time. Adults who had spent years in law enforcement, in legal practice, and in jury duty had never encountered anything like this. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "Order," he called firmly, though his voice betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. He could not deny what he had just witnessed. Max's behavior was unprecedented. It challenged assumptions and cast doubt over one of the prosecution's core pieces of evidence. Every observer in the room understood the implications. If the K-9 could be influenced by something so intangible as a child's presence, then how reliable was the demonstration meant to secure the conviction? His mother finally whispered gently, "That's enough, honey," but didn't move, eyes locked on Max. Her innocence and intuition had created a fragile, almost magical bond. The dog, trained to obey, had deferred to a child's pure, uncalculated influence. It was a phenomenon no one could explain, and yet everyone could see it with their own eyes. Detectives scribbled notes furiously, recognizing that this moment would define the trial. Expert analysis would follow, but the visual evidence, the hesitation, the softened stance, the connection was undeniable. He glanced at the jury, nodding their curious, wide-eyed expressions. Doubt had already seeped into the room, uninvited but impossible to dismiss. As the recess was finally called, tension lingered like smoke. The prosecution huddled with Max's handler, debating next steps, while the defense whispered excitedly, recognizing the turning tide. Oblivious to the magnitude of her impact, hugged her rabbit and smiled at Max. The dog, obedient but visibly affected, wagged his tail slightly, eyes soft and attentive. Outside, the town waited, unaware that inside the courthouse, the balance of justice had already begun to shift. And inside, every adult realized that the next moments would determine whether the smallest voice in the room could indeed change the course of a trial. The courtroom was tense, almost suffocating, as everyone tried to reconcile what had just occurred. Max, the police dog, sat near the evidence table, his amber eyes occasionally flicking toward. The crowd seemed frozen in a shared disbelief, whispers barely escaping lips. Every professional in the room, prosecutors, defense attorneys, law enforcement, was acutely aware that the carefully constructed trial was teetering on the edge of unpredictability. For hours, they had relied on protocols, trained witnesses, and procedural certainty. Now, a 3-year-old had introduced chaos with nothing more than her voice and her gaze. His mother tried to soothe her daughter, whispering softly, "Sweetheart, it's okay, just watch quietly." But attention was entirely on Max. Her tiny fingers clutched the stuffed rabbit and she leaned forward slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if she were communicating through sheer focus. Every adult in the courtroom felt it. The room's energy had shifted. Even the most hardened jurors and seasoned attorneys were captivated, caught between disbelief and fascination. The smallest, most innocent voice had pierced through layers of intimidation and authority. Detective, standing near the back, scribbled notes rapidly. He had never seen anything like this in his career. Max's hesitation had already raised questions about the reliability of the evidence. The dog's behavior was clear. He was responding not just to scent but to an intangible influence, herself. Glanced at the jury, observing the flickers of doubt in their eyes. Even without understanding the technicalities of K-9 training, they sensed something extraordinary was unfolding. The prosecutor's jaw clenched as he whispered to his assistant, frustration laced in his voice. "We can't have the dog faltering like this. It undermines everything." His eyes darted toward Max, whose gaze remained locked on, unaffected by the stern commands being issued. The handler tried nudging the dog forward, but Max's body language betrayed subtle resistance. He was alert, but compliant only to a point, deferring instead to the influence of the child. Small voice cut across the room again, soft but unmistakable. "It's okay, he won't hurt anyone." The words, simple and innocent, seemed to echo with unexpected authority. Max's posture relaxed even further, his tail lowering slightly as if acknowledging the truth in her tone. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Even the judge, who prided himself on impartiality and composure, leaned forward, eyebrows knitted in confusion. No adult had said anything, yet a child had managed to alter the behavior of a highly trained professional dog in the midst of a live trial. The defense attorney seized the moment, leaning toward the defendant with a barely perceptible smile. "Do you see this?" she whispered. The defendant's pale face reflected a mix of fear, hope, and disbelief. He had felt powerless throughout the trial, watching the prosecution assemble their case like a meticulously built machine. Yet now, that machine had a flaw no one could have predicted. A child, with no understanding of the law or the stakes, had become the center of attention, tilting the balance ever so slightly. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread among reporters and spectators. Social media lit up with headlines. 3-year-old interrupts police K9 demonstration in court. Child's innocence stops key evidence. Trial takes shocking turn. The quiet town, usually consumed with mundane routines and neighborly gossip, had become the stage for something unprecedented. People across the country wondered how such a small voice could influence events so profoundly. Inside, the courtroom's atmosphere grew more charged. Lawyers and detectives spoke in hushed tones, consulting over strategy, protocol, and potential repercussions. The prosecution debated whether to proceed with the demonstration or call for a recess, understanding that Max's hesitation had already planted doubt in the minds of the jurors. The defense leaned forward subtly, knowing that this moment could define the case. Every adult felt it. Control had slipped. Oblivious to the gravity of her actions, tilted her head toward Max again. "Don't be scared," she whispered. "He's nice." The dog's ears twitched, and his stance softened even more. He remained alert, of course, but the aggression or certainty expected from a demonstration had vanished. The courtroom had transformed into a delicate dance of innocence and trained instinct, and his voice was the conductor. Detective's pen moved quickly across his notebook. He had seen trained dogs react to fear, commands, or treats, but never to innocence. This was different. Max's hesitation wasn't a failure. It was a response, a recognition that explanation but was as real as any piece of evidence. The judge, sensing the unprecedented nature of the situation, glanced toward the attorneys. He had to consider the implications. Could the demonstration proceed if the dog's behavior was influenced by external, uncontrollable factors? Every decision carried weight, and the courtroom was acutely aware of it. The prosecutor's assistant whispered urgently, "Do we stop this?" The lead attorney's face was a mask of controlled frustration. "No," he said finally, though his voice betrayed unease. "We continue, but note this." He gestured subtly toward the jury. The message was clear. Even the prosecution acknowledged the unexpected variable, the tiny force of influence that was. His mother finally whispered, gently but firmly, "Honey, time to be quiet now." Nodded, still clutching her rabbit, eyes shining with the clarity only a child could possess. She had no concept of what she had done, no idea that her words had unsettled a courtroom, altered the behavior of a trained police dog, and shaken the foundation of a legal case. Yet everyone else in that room understood. Her innocence had spoken louder than months of planning, testimony, and preparation. And as the courtroom paused, the collective awareness settled over the room like a heavy fog. What had started as a routine trial in a quiet town was now something extraordinary. The smallest voice had pierced the structured silence of authority, leaving adults, jurors, and law enforcement alike questioning assumptions, reconsidering evidence, and realizing that the next moments might irrevocably change the course of justice. The moment the judge called for a brief recess, the courtroom seemed to exhale, though tension still clung to the air like thick fog. Attorneys whispered urgently, leaning over the polished wood of the benches, debating what had just happened. Max, the police dog, now sat calmly near the evidence table, his amber eyes still flicking toward, as if silently acknowledging her presence. The courtroom was no longer just a room of law and procedure. It had become a battlefield of perception, where innocence and instinct collided with protocol and authority. The prosecution huddled with Max's handler, their voices low but urgent. "This wasn't supposed to happen," the lead attorney hissed, running a hand through his hair. "The dog's reaction is compromised. The jury saw it. They all saw it." The assistant whispered in agreement, panic lacing his words. "We can't continue like this without addressing it. We risk everything if we do." But the lead attorney shook his head, his face pale but determined. "We can't back down now. Too much is at stake." Across the aisle, the defense attorney's eyes sparkled with barely concealed satisfaction. She leaned toward her client, whispering, "Do you see what's happening? They're scrambling, and it's all because of a child." The defendant's hands trembled slightly, but a flicker of hope crossed his pale face. For weeks, he had sat through testimony and evidence that seemed inescapable. Now, the momentum had shifted, fragile but undeniable. A 3-year-old, with nothing but her words and presence, had injected doubt where there had been certainty. Oblivious to the storm she had unleashed, clutched her stuffed rabbit and whispered softly to Max, "It's okay, don't be scared." The dog's ears twitched in response, and he shifted slightly, a subtle but unmistakable sign that the connection between them was real. Witnesses and jurors alike leaned forward, eyes wide, some whispering, some frozen, all captivated by the improbable bond. Every adult in the room understood in that moment that they were no longer in control of the narrative. Detective moved toward the back of the room, notebook in hand. He scribbled furiously, documenting the dog's reactions, words, and the reactions of everyone in the courtroom. Years of experience had taught him that evidence was only as strong as perception, and perception was now in question. Even trained K-9 units could falter when confronted with variables beyond conditioning. What had done was unprecedented, and he knew that the trial's trajectory had already shifted. Outside the courtroom, whispers of the unusual proceedings had reached the press. Reporters leaned into cameras, microphones poised, capturing the unfolding drama. Social media lit up with posts and live streams. 3-year-old Halt's police K-9 in court. Trial takes unthinkable turn. Child, words shake legal proceedings. For a town used to quiet streets and ordinary lives, had become the epicenter of a story that no one could ignore. Inside, the courtroom descended into controlled chaos. Lawyers debated the propriety of continuing the demonstration. The judge, usually a figure of unshakable authority, leaned forward in the bench, fingers steepled. "This is unusual," he admitted quietly, almost to himself. "Unprecedented even." The jury fidgeted, exchanging glances, whispering among themselves. Witnesses shifted uneasily, unsure whether to continue with testimony or wait for guidance. Every protocol and procedural expectation had collided with a force no one could anticipate: a child's innocence. The prosecution attempted to regain composure. The lead attorney gave a low, sharp command to Max, trying to assert authority. The handler followed, giving cues meant to redirect the dog's focus. Max responded, but subtly, almost reluctantly. He sniffed the evidence, approached carefully, yet his movements were measured, hesitant. The courtroom noticed immediately. Nothing aggressive, nothing decisive, just uncertainty. Leaned slightly closer, still whispering, her small voice steady and unwavering. "It's okay, he won't hurt anyone." Max's ears twitched again, and his tail, previously stiff, lowered slightly. He maintained alertness, but the confidence expected from a demonstration had vanished entirely. Gasps and murmurs swept through the courtroom. The defense attorney leaned forward, eyes gleaming. The prosecution's lead attorney's jaw tightened, fingers gripping the edge of the table. This was no longer a simple demonstration. It was a spectacle that undermined months of preparation. Detective scribbled faster, nodding that Max's hesitation was now more pronounced than before. The dog's instincts had been influenced by, and every observer in the room could see it. Jurors whispered to each other, a subtle but growing undercurrent of doubt spreading. The lead prosecutor argued quietly with his assistant, tension rising, words clipped. "We can't ignore this," he said finally. "The credibility of the K-9 is in question." The judge called the courtroom back to order, though the shift in energy was undeniable. Still clutching her rabbit, tilted her head toward Max. The dog, once a symbol of certainty and trained precision, now seemed almost reflective, as if weighing the situation carefully. The courtroom held its breath, caught between law, instinct, and the unpredictable force of a child's innocence. Outside the courtroom, spectators whispered, cameras clicked, and reporters typed furiously. The news spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. 3-year-old changes courtroom dynamics. K-9 hesitation forces reevaluation of evidence. Once sleepy and predictable, had become a stage for a story that reason, logic, and expectations. Inside's presence had created a ripple effect. Every adult, every authority figure, and every juror felt it. The trial, meticulously planned and carefully executed, now teetered on the edge of chaos. Evidence once considered decisive was now questionable. Witness credibility was under scrutiny. The courtroom itself, a symbol of order and structure, had become a theater where innocence and instinct held more power than procedure or law. And as the recess ended, the judge called everyone back to their seats. The tension was palpable, thick enough to touch. The smallest participant in the trial hugged her rabbit and gazed at Max with trust and assurance. Max, in turn, remained calm but attentive, his amber eyes softening. The adults, meanwhile, understood the truth. What had happened during that recess was more than a disruption. It was a shift in power, a reminder that control was fragile, and that even the most structured system could be unsettled by innocence, intuition, and the simplest of words. For the courtroom, for everyone watching and waiting, one thing was clear: the trial would never be the same again. And the question lingered, unspoken but heavy in the air. How much could a 3-year-old truly change the course of justice? The courtroom had gone from tense to fragile, like glass stretched to its breaking point. Every adult inside felt it. The sudden unpredictability introduced by a child's presence had upended the meticulous choreography of the trial. Max, the police dog, lay quietly near the evidence table now, ears flicking intermittently toward, who clutched her stuffed rabbit and watched him with the innocent concentration only a 3-year-old could muster. The air was thick with anticipation, every whisper and movement amplified. The court had become a theater of uncertainty, and no one knew what would happen next. Judge Harmon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, fingers steepled. He had seen trials of all kinds, but never one like this. A K-9 demonstration was a routine, controlled procedure, a mechanical verification of evidence. Yet here, a small child had demonstrated that even the most reliable training could be influenced by something entirely unpredictable. He cleared his throat, projecting authority but feeling the weight of the unexpected. "We are in uncharted territory," he said, voice steady but carrying an edge of disbelief. "The court must consider whether the demonstration as conducted can be deemed reliable evidence." The prosecutor's lead attorney, normally composed, ran a hand over his face, jaw tight. The assistant whispered urgently, almost panic-stricken, "Judge, we cannot let this jeopardize months of work." The lead attorney nodded, but his eyes betrayed doubt. Max had faltered. The jurors had seen it. His innocent intervention had left a visible mark on the proceedings. Protocol and evidence aside, perception now ruled the courtroom. One mistake, or one unanticipated moment, could unravel everything. Across the aisle, the defense attorney's eyes sparkled with quiet triumph. She whispered to the defendant, who sat tensely, hands gripping the edge of the table. "Do you see?" she murmured. "They can't control everything. This changes everything for us." The defendant swallowed hard, disbelief and hope mingling on his face. Weeks of fear and uncertainty now seemed to hinge on a tiny, curly-haired girl who had no understanding of the law, yet whose presence had introduced a variable no one could ignore. The jury shifted uncomfortably, their notebooks open but forgotten. Their eyes followed, and Max, sensing the extraordinary dynamic. They were witnessing something that logic yet was undeniably real. Some whispered quietly, "Did you see that?" Others simply stared, trying to reconcile months of evidence with what they had just observed. The trial's outcome, meticulously planned, now felt fragile, malleable, uncertain. Detective stepped forward quietly, notebook in hand, documenting every subtle movement. The slight softening of Max's stance, the tentative sniffing of the evidence, the way his attention remained partially fixed on. Years of experience had taught him that evidence was never just facts on paper. Perception shaped interpretation, and the jury's perception was now irrevocably altered. He scribbled rapidly, knowing that future testimony would focus on this unprecedented event. The judge called an immediate meeting with attorneys and experts in chambers. "We need a reassessment of the evidence and the K-9 demonstration," he stated firmly. "We are treading in uncharted legal waters. The credibility of this demonstration is now in question." The attorneys nodded, some reluctantly, some eagerly. Expert witnesses were summoned to discuss K-9 behavior, training protocols, and whether a dog's reactions could be influenced by factors beyond scent, especially in this case, a child's presence. Outside, the story had already begun to spread like wildfire. Social media feeds exploded with speculation and headlines. 3-year-old shakes trial. Child's words challenge evidence in court. K-9 demonstration called into question. Reporters clamored to capture reactions from the courthouse, while the quiet town of watched, stunned, as their once ordinary trial became a national spectacle. Families gathered around TVs and phones, marveling at how a child's innocence had so dramatically shifted the narrative. Inside the courtroom, tension reached a new height. The judge returned, the jury in place, and the attorneys poised for what might be the most critical discussion yet. The prosecution argued, quietly but urgently, about the necessity of demonstrating the K-9's reliability without external influence. The defense countered with subtle emphasis. The dog's hesitation revealed doubt that could not be ignored. The judge listened carefully, balancing the arguments, aware that any decision could dramatically affect the trial's trajectory. Meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the weight of her influence. She whispered softly to Max again, a quiet reassurance. "It's okay, you're my friend." The dog's ears flicked once more, and he relaxed slightly, though his trained alertness never wavered completely. The courtroom, however, hung on every sound, every gesture. Adults, trained to control and predict behavior, could do nothing but observe the subtle yet profound connection between child and dog. Detective noted the jurors' reactions, curiosity, uncertainty, and a faint ripple of doubt spreading among them. Max's hesitation, coupled with his presence, had created a fracture in the prosecution's case. The trial, once a predictable legal sequence, now felt uncertain and volatile. Every professional in the room understood that the next steps would be crucial. The credibility of the K-9, once taken for granted, was now the subject of intense scrutiny. The judge finally addressed the courtroom, voice calm but deliberate. Due to the unforeseen influence on the K-9's demonstration, the court must review the admissibility of this evidence. All parties are instructed to prepare for a possible reassessment of key elements of the trial. Murmurs rippled through the room. The jurors leaned forward, witnesses whispered to one another, and attorneys scribbled notes furiously. His mother hugged her daughter tightly, whispering reassurance, though his innocent gaze remained on Max. The weight of the moment was palpable. Months of preparation, testimonies, and evidence hung in the balance. And yet all of it had been challenged, not by expert witnesses, not by new discoveries, but by the quiet, unassuming presence of a 3-year-old child. For the courtroom, for everyone watching, the trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It had become a testament to the unexpected power of innocence, intuition, and the smallest voice commanding the largest attention. Outside, the town waited, unaware of the courtroom drama unfolding. Inside, adults understood that the trajectory of justice had shifted, teetering on the edge of uncertainty. The question now loomed large. Would this reassessment change the trial entirely, or had words already altered the course of events in ways no adult could predict? The courtroom felt suspended in time, as if the air itself had thickened. Every pair of eyes in the room followed, the 3-year-old who had become the most unlikely force in a high-profile trial. Max, the police dog, lay obediently near the evidence table, but his amber eyes flicked constantly toward the child, alert yet calm. Outside, cameras and reporters pressed for glimpses of the extraordinary scene, their whispers and clicks muted behind the walls of the courthouse. Inside, every adult knew that the trial, meticulously prepared for months, had reached a critical juncture. Judge Harmon leaned forward, fingers steepled, and surveyed the room with a gravity he rarely displayed. The courtroom had become a stage where innocence, instinct, and law intersected in ways no one could anticipate. The K-9 demonstration, intended as irrefutable proof, had faltered under the soft, unwavering influence of a child. Oblivious to her impact, clutched her stuffed rabbit and whispered softly, "It's okay, you're safe." The words, gentle and innocent, had created an almost imperceptible shift, yet it was enough to ripple through the minds of jurors, attorneys, and law enforcement alike. The prosecutor's assistant muttered under his breath, tension straining every word. "This could ruin us. They'll question everything, Max. The procedure, the evidence, it's all compromised." The lead attorney's jaw tightened. He tried to maintain composure, to recall months of meticulous preparation, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Max's hesitation had already undermined their carefully built narrative. Even if the dog performed flawlessly under ordinary circumstances, the jury had seen what had happened. The seed of doubt had been planted. Across the aisle, the defense attorney leaned closer to her client, a subtle smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Do you see?" she whispered. "The trial isn't what they expected, and it's never going to be the same." The defendant, pale and trembling, nodded almost imperceptibly. Weeks of fear and anxiety now mingled with a cautious, fragile hope. He had faced what seemed like insurmountable odds, and now the smallest participant in the room had shifted the balance. The jury fidgeted, notebooks open but largely ignored. Their eyes flitted between and Max, sensing the extraordinary dynamic unfolding. Jurors whispered quietly, eyebrows raised, trying to reconcile months of evidence with the unpredictable, untrained force of a child's influence. Every adult in the room felt the subtle but undeniable reality. Control had slipped, and the courtroom was now held hostage by innocence itself. Detectives stood near the back, notebook in hand, documenting every subtle movement. The softening of Max's stance, the careful sniffing of evidence, the way his focus remained partially fixed on. Years of law enforcement had taught him that perception could shape outcomes as much as fact or procedure. And right now, perception was in flux, irreversibly altered by the improbable connection between child and dog. Judge Harmon called the courtroom to attention, his voice firm yet carrying the weight of uncertainty. "We are entering uncharted territory," he said. "The demonstration conducted by the K9 has been influenced by factors outside of training protocols. As such, the court must consider the credibility and admissibility of this evidence moving forward." Murmurs spread across the courtroom. Jurors leaned forward, lawyers whispered urgently, and witnesses exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time in the trial, the procedural certainty that had been the foundation of the case was gone. Oblivious to the magnitude of her presence, whispered to Max again, "It's okay, don't be scared." The dog's ears flicked in response, his posture relaxed but alert. The smallest voice in the room had commanded the largest attention, and everyone understood it. The courtroom had become a crucible where law, innocence, and instinct collided, each influencing the other in unpredictable ways. Outside, the press buzzed with speculation. Social media feeds exploded with headlines. 3-year-old shakes trial. Child alters K9 evidence in court. Innocence versus procedure. Trial takes unprecedented turn. In a town accustomed to calm routines, had become the epicenter of a story that logic, law, and expectation. Families gathered around screens, captivated by how a child's words could ripple through a courtroom, challenging months of evidence and strategy. Inside, the judge's gavel tapped softly against the bench, calling the courtroom to order. He addressed the jurors directly, his voice calm but deliberate. "You have witnessed events that are highly unusual. The court has ordered a reassessment of key evidence due to unforeseen influence on the K9 demonstration. You are instructed to consider this carefully when evaluating the credibility of all testimony related to the evidence." The jurors nodded, absorbing the gravity of the statement, aware that this single, unexpected factor could influence their deliberations profoundly. The prosecution tried to regain control. Commands were issued, notes passed, subtle cues to the jury emphasized the procedural rigor that had been followed, but the damage was done. Max's hesitation had been observed, recorded, and understood. The defense attorney whispered quietly to her client, "They can't spin this. They've lost the narrative." The defendant's hands trembled, hope mingling with disbelief. He had survived the courtroom tension before, but never like this. His innocent presence remained the fulcrum of the room. She tilted her head slightly toward Max, her voice soft and unwavering. "It's okay, you're my friend." The dog's response was subtle but unmistakable, a relaxation of posture, a softening of his stance. Adults, trained to command and control, could only observe the interplay of innocence and instinct, knowing they were witnessing a rare, almost magical phenomenon. Detective exhaled quietly, noting every reaction, every shift in body language. The trial, once predictable and controlled, had been irrevocably altered. Every professional in the room understood the weight of the moment. The next steps would determine whether the court could navigate this unprecedented disruption, or whether the innocence of a child would continue to upend the established order of justice. The courtroom, holding its collective breath, waited for the next move. Everyone understood the magnitude. What had started as a routine trial in a quiet town had become a story that would be remembered, a testament to the power of innocence, perception, and the smallest voices commanding the largest influence. And in that moment, all eyes, from the judge to the jurors to the press outside, were on a 3-year-old girl who had, without realizing it, become the most important participant in a high-stakes courtroom drama. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Judge Harmon adjusted his glasses and looked across the room. Months of preparation, witness testimony, and evidence had led to this moment, yet everything now hung on an unpredictable factor: a 3-year-old girl. Sitting quietly in her mother's lap, clutched her stuffed rabbit, unaware of the magnitude of her presence. Max, the police dog, remained calm but alert, his amber eyes fixed on her. Every adult in the room held their breath, recognizing that the trial's trajectory had shifted in a way no one could have anticipated. The judge's voice, firm but measured, cut through the tension. The court acknowledges that the K-9 demonstration was influenced by an external factor, namely the presence of a child. Due to this, the admissibility and reliability of this evidence must be reconsidered. Murmurs swept through the gallery. Jurors exchanged glances, whispering softly. Lawyers scribbled notes frantically, recalculating arguments, strategy, and the future of the case. Detective, standing near the back, scribbled rapidly, knowing that he was witnessing a once-in-a-career moment where innocence directly impacted the course of justice. The prosecution leaned forward, a mixture of frustration and disbelief crossing his face. "Your Honor," he began carefully, voice steady despite the tension, "we followed protocol precisely. The demonstration was designed to remove any doubt regarding the evidence. A K-9's training is reliable." The judge raised a hand, stopping him. "The court recognizes that, but what occurred cannot be ignored." The jury observed hesitation in the K-9's response directly linked to an external influence. "The question now is whether this evidence can fairly inform your verdict." The defense attorney smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving. She whispered to the defendant, who sat rigid with anticipation, "This is the moment." The defendant's hands trembled slightly, but a flicker of hope crossed his face for the first time in weeks. Months of fear, anxiety, and uncertainty now seemed balanced on the edge of a child's voice, her innocence introducing doubt that even trained professionals could not dismiss. Unaware of her importance, whispered softly again to Max, "It's okay, don't be scared." The dog's ears flicked, and his stance softened, tail lowering slightly. Every adult in the room noticed the subtle but powerful signal. A demonstration that had once been certain was now undermined by the pure presence of a child. The courtroom, which had been built on rules and procedure, now felt alive with unpredictability, every heartbeat measured against the fragile balance of the trial. Judge Harmon leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "Given these extraordinary circumstances," he said, voice steady but solemn, "the court finds that the K-9 demonstration cannot be used as decisive evidence. Its reliability has been compromised, and the jury is instructed to disregard this portion of the presentation in their deliberations." A ripple of shock and disbelief moved through the prosecution team. The defense breathed quietly but intentionally, understanding that this single decision could redefine the entire trial. The jury, eyes wide, scribbled notes and whispered softly among themselves. Even without a clear understanding of the dog's behavior or role, they recognized the extraordinary nature of what had just occurred. Doubt had entered the room in a form no one could have prepared for, a child's intuition and innocence influencing a trained K-9 in a courtroom setting. It was a moment that logic yet demanded recognition. Outside, the press erupted, social media feeds exploding with updates. 3-year-old stops K-9 evidence in court. Innocence overrides protocol in trial. Child halts key demonstration. Court reassesses evidence. The quiet town of, long removed from national attention, was now at the center of a story that would be remembered for years to come. Families shared screens and phones, marveling at how one small voice could ripple through a system built on meticulous procedure and rigid protocol. Inside, the defense attorney leaned toward her client again, whispering, "This could change everything. Your chance is real now." The defendant, pale and trembling, nodded, a flicker of hope breaking through weeks of fear. Months of evidence had been undermined, at least partially, by the unassuming presence of a child whose words had influenced both a highly trained dog and the perception of the jury. It was extraordinary, improbable, and undeniably powerful. His mother finally whispered to her daughter, gently guiding her to hug her rabbit. "Honey, you've been very brave. That's enough for now." Tilted her head toward Max one last time, murmuring softly, "Good boy, you're safe." The dog responded with a calm, steady gaze, as if acknowledging that the moment had passed. The adults in the room, however, could not forget the impact. Every procedure, every testimony, and every strategy had been irrevocably influenced by the smallest participant. Detective exhaled, closing his notebook for the first time that day. He had seen trained K-9s react to commands, threats, and environmental cues, but never had he witnessed such a clear influence from innocence itself. Unaware of her role, had done something remarkable. She had shifted the balance of perception, reminding everyone present that human intuition, and the trust inherent in a child's voice, could override even the most precise planning. Judge Harmon called the courtroom to order once more. The trial will proceed, but all parties are reminded that the K-9 demonstration is no longer to be considered decisive evidence. The court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances and the importance of assessing all evidence fairly, without undue influence. Murmurs spread through the courtroom, but a calm determination replaced the tension. The balance of the trial had shifted, and every adult understood that it was no longer just about evidence. It was about perception, judgment, and the unpredictable influence of the human heart. As the trial resumed, the courtroom felt lighter yet more intense. Small and unaware, hugged her rabbit and smiled at Max, who wagged his tail slightly, obedient yet alert. Outside, buzzed with curiosity, awe, and a story that would become legend. How a 3-year-old girl, armed with nothing but words and innocence, had stopped a K-9 in court and forced a reassessment of evidence that could change the course of justice. In that quiet yet extraordinary courtroom, it became clear. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power, and the most unassuming actions can alter lives, perception, and even the course of history. His words had done exactly that, and its residents and everyone watching knew they had witnessed something truly remarkable.